Hello, everybody. Welcome. Come in. Take your seats. Hello. Hello. Good morning. All right. Welcome to the Gallatin class of 2021. All right. And to our new transfer students, I'm very sorry that the theater is not big enough to hold everybody. But those who are out in the lobby or upstairs, welcome to you. We're very glad to have you here as well. Welcome also to the Gallatin faculty, new and returning. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you this year, discussing such complex works as are before us, works that speak to our present moment in very powerful ways. And before I just say a few words, I want to ask all the Gallatin faculty to stand. All right. Some of them are in the back. It's really great to see all you guys. Thank you for coming. And part of what makes being here so great are those people that just stood up. So this is a somber time on a very, very beautiful morning. Luckily, the rains came yesterday, and today we have our fresh beginning. But there are other parts in the country where rains coming don't go away quickly, and it's a very dark and horrifying time to watch what's happening in Houston. I won't dwell on this, but I'll say a few words about it a little bit later in my remarks. We have chosen to spend some of this year as a school considering the question of climate change. So it's not just for this opening event, actually. It's going to be a theme that we're going to be exploring in a variety of ways. So choosing this topic for convocation was an easy choice. It was an appropriate issue for us. And the first thing that you're going to see is that not the first week of classes, but the second week of classes, on Thursday, September 14th and Friday, September 15th, we are hosting a small climate change conference right here in the theater, which will begin with a keynote address on Thursday night by a nationally renowned thinker and activist on these issues named Naomi Oreskes, and she's actually mentioned by Ghosh in his book. So look her up. Not now, but look her up so you learn a little bit about who she is and why it's pretty cool that she's coming. And we're also going to have a gallery exhibit of artists on climate change. And on Friday, a very exciting series of conference panels and discussions. And just for you to understand, of course you're going to have classes, you're not going to be able to go to everything, but many of these panels have Gallatin faculty members speaking on them. So one of the great benefits of coming to what you're able to come to is that you'll get a chance to meet and learn about faculty members, some of whose classes you may be in, some of whose classes you may be thinking about enrolling in. And transfer students, I want to say to you, it's particularly relevant for you since you have a shorter time to get to know the Gallatin faculty. So this is a great opportunity for you to come and meet a good many of them. So this is a very exciting moment. Today at our convocation, where we try to set the intellectual tone for the year and for your studies, we are bringing in to bear multiple fields of study, different humanities fields, literature, philosophy, politics, and critical, creative nonfiction, we might call it, essay writing. We're also going to be having some music to bring the arts a little bit into our morning. But this is our Gallatin way to try to think of different intellectual, artistic, cultural ways of approaching the kinds of problems that are being discussed. So with that, let me say a few words about a couple of our texts. Amitav Ghosh, who is a wonderful novelist, and it's really as a novelist that he approaches the opening sets of questions that he asks about why we don't have fictions and novels about climate change, why these are always getting shunted off into this lower category, which later he comes back to critique of science fiction. But he sees his own fiction as implicated in this story. So he's asking questions that are very personal. But as you saw, he's also a great essayist. And in this powerful book, he directs our attention to the mysteriousness of scale, to the fact that we as individual beings and the cultures that we've created seem essentially unable to countenance the massiveness, the enormity of the changes underway on the planet, and the ways in which they are in this moment reshaping so many aspects of our lives. He focuses his story initially around several interrelated experiences of what we might call unexpected or unforeseen disasters. The sudden and completely unexpected tornado that hits Delhi when he's there. And the scale of the destructiveness, its destructive power, so far beyond this word that's very crucial for him, believability, right? You wouldn't believe it could be true. And the equally unexpected and until now not predicted likelihood of cyclones and hurricanes that might threaten Mumbai. Such events, he suggests, were viewed as so improbable that there was no reason that a modern city, and we have to underline the word modern, would have to think about them or plan for them. We don't need to do that. We're in control of nature. These aren't threats to us. Ghost shows that in the case of the cyclones that might hit Mumbai, how evidence is there if you look for it. But no one thought to look for it until fairly recently. What he wants us to see, and what he himself avoided seeing, is how our civilizations have been built around a kind of determined blindness to the power of the earth. They are based, he suggests, on a practical norm, a set of expectations that he defines as a bourgeois and a technocratic, and we might even say sort of pseudo-scientific, resistance to anything that would disrupt a set of pragmatic expectations that tell us that we understand the world and can control its risks and threats. We resist what he calls the environmental uncanny. So these are just two quotes from him that captures this set of issues. He writes, "The practical men who ran colonies and founded cities had evidently acquired their indifference to the destructive power of the earth much earlier." And he's pointing to the fact that in the 19th century, a lot of poets wrote about the power of the earth in their studies, their writings about the sublime. So all the way through the 19th century says there was imaginative work that's still really thinking about this. But the people who were founding the cities seem, even before that, to have decided that they would be indifferent to what he calls the power of the earth. That quote's on page 56. And here's another one from page 62. "The earth of the Anthropocene is precisely a world of insistent, inescapable continuities, animated by forces that are nothing if not inconceivably vast." So again, the question of the scale of what we're confronted with and how, as individuals, we can feel disconnected to these large things that are so big. We did not know when we chose the text for this year, obviously, that we would be discussing these issues in the midst of a true national calamity, a hurricane that has brought and is still in the present tense bringing unprecedented and life-destroying flooding from which it will take many, many years to recover. Like New York after Sandy or New Orleans after Katrina, many aspects of life in Houston and the surrounding counties will have been transformed. So questions of scale are really pushing themselves upon us in a very immediate and direct way. And I was happy on Monday that we had a few of our students from Houston had been able to get here, one having left just a little bit before the storm hit. I'm sure there are still some that won't be here till even later than the end of this week, but we're all in touch and helping to make sure they're, caught up on what they missed. The question of scale and the reasons that it becomes impossible to think beyond a very circumscribed framework have also hit us politically this year. Just as the climate floods Houston, threatening lives, so many already lost in the flooding, basic health is also threatened for months and years to come. Just as that's happening in a climate way, We also, I think, have been facing other kinds of outbreaks of massive change and political extremes that only a year or two ago would have seemed highly improbable, if not impossible. So again, this idea about what is probable and the way you build your life on a kind of model of pragmatic probability, that could never happen. This could never be. And what that does to civilizations. Charlottesville, the demonstrations and the violence and the death in Charlottesville was an intense demonstration of a white supremacy and neo-Nazi force that was politically aggressive in ways which most people, again, would not have thought possible or probable only a few years ago. I think many of us have had a feeling of constant tension as day after day new political crises and extremes emerge. So improbable, this word that Ghosh comes back to over and over again, the way we try to build a notion of pragmatic security based on these concepts. This sense of scale in the case of climate change is even larger, perhaps, than those of the political metaphors of waves I've been discussing. But like climate change, political change can seem to flood the land. I think that both issues raise the question, and this is for me what I took away most powerfully from all our readings. What is the relationship of the individual to the larger world and to the natural systems that we live in? What is the individual's relation to large-scale events, what sometimes in the Renaissance was called the relationship of microcosm to macrocosm? So how much do we feel that one little vote against the flood of votes makes a difference? How do we understand ourselves as small figures in the midst of this vast and large set of events? And I think that's a very serious problem for all of us because it tends to lead towards a sense of disempowerment. This is a time when Ghosh's analysis of the exclusion of climate change stories from the high category of the novel, the dismissal of them to science fiction, only underlines the lack of narratives in general, our inability to tell stories we believe in about the immensity of climate change. And that's the important thing. Do we really believe in the things we're saying? So part of his account, and this was very important to me as a literary scholar, is that in the humanities, apparently a discipline we think of as outside of the technocratic world, outside of technocratic control, but in the humanities, we have already accepted this model of reasonability, he argues, of what is probably and likely as a way to, we've accepted this model of what is likely, what is probable, as a way both to define a certain aesthetic and also as a way to blind ourselves to the impact we ourselves may have been having. I want to say just a few words about Hippocrates and then move on to a conclusion. I'm not going to be able to talk about all our texts today, but luckily we have a great panel that will do that. I just wanted to say a word or two about Hippocrates, who of course comes from classical Greece, the time of Pericles, of the great tragedies that many of you have studied, Antigone, Oedipus the King. This is the same period of Greek culture that Hippocrates is coming out of. He was 27 years younger than Sophocles and about the same age as Socrates. He would have lived about as long as, Socrates would have lived about as long, the same lifespan as Hippocrates had he not drunk the hemlock. He was 32 years older than Plato, who does mention him in a number of dialogues. So in reading some of the Hippocrates, it may be tempting to think some of his conclusions are funny. Did anybody of you feel that way? Funny or sort of crazy, little ridiculous? Yeah. His belief that climate change shapes characters and health must clearly be wrong, one thinks, as we know that in each region and civilization that he discusses, there's as much variation of human shape, body type, health, and character. So what can he mean by asserting the dominance of climate? And we, of course, do talk about climate. We talk about all you guys, part of that contingent from California. We always talk about how the California students will be depressed in December and February when they don't have sun, you know, that they have to have sun. Of course, nobody says, well, we all need to have sun. So, and we also, as we move more and more towards imagining brain chemistry as affecting so much of personality, we also have moved closer to the notion that other things, waters, pollution, land, might in fact affect brain chemistry. But nonetheless, I think in some basic way, a lot of what Hippocrates says sounds really strange to us. So my thoughts about this, and obviously it could be discussed better by pulling out quotes and talking about the passages, but I think that in trying to explain the role of climate and the physical environment on health and character, Hippocrates is trying to capture some of the issues of scale that Ghosh addresses in a very different way. What is the relationship between the individual and the larger universe we live in? Is there really no relation? We live in a context where our own individual health is felt as just that. It's felt as our health individually. I go to the doctor, they check me out. It's not about whether my building has problems or whatever. Epidemiology tells us that large-scale patterns emerge. X people with this genetic format are likely to be susceptible to Y disease. But we don't think that there's really a link between health, character, and the very forces of climate. And some of you might be thinking, well, I think that, so why is she saying we? And maybe I am being a little too generalizing, but I do think that in general, the way we approach health in the culture of the United States, and I think in many cultures around the world, is right now one that looks at the individual body. So what, as I said, in the Renaissance would have been called the relation of microcosm to macrocosm is something that we remain profoundly skeptical about. We're really not convinced that this is the thing that's going to change us. And Ghosh would say that this skepticism is very much to our peril. So I'm not saying that everything Hippocrates says is literally true, but I'm thinking that his way of trying to think about medicine through the lens of climate is perhaps not something that we need to look as simply something that's ridiculous or an old-fashioned point of view or something so much that we can dismiss, but rather try to understand what we might be able to learn from it. I thought I would end my remarks by something very different, which is that in his play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare also addresses the questions of climate change and climate disaster, and he personifies two figures. How many of you have read Midsummer Night's Dream? All right, so you'll know what I'm talking about. Titania and Oberon, who are feminine and male principles, feminine and masculine principles of the natural order. They are the sort of figures of nature. And they're having a fight, principally because Oberon, the male, the king of the fairies, is actually a male-dominating creep who is trying to control everything that Titania does with a young child who was born of one of her votaries. So they're in a battle over sexism. And in that battle, because they symbolize two different kinds of natural forces, nature itself has been disrupted. And I want to read you slowly a few of the comments that they make, that Titania makes. She says, "Never, since the middle summer's spring, met we on hill, in dale, forest, or mead, or in the beached margin of the sea, to dance our ringlets to the whistling wind, but with thy brawls thou hast disturbed our sport." So you've been messing us up, whether we're at the beach or in the woods or dancing. "Therefore," she says, "because of this discord between us, the winds, piping to us in vain, as in revenge, have sucked up from the sea contagious fogs, which, falling in the land, hath every pelting river made so proud that they have overborne their continents. So the winds have sucked up air from the sea, creating contagious fogs that have made the rivers go over their boundaries. So what are they doing? They're flooding, right? The rivers made so proud that they have overborne their continents, the thing that should hold them in. So this is a story that starts with floods. "The ox, therefore, hath stretched his yoke in vain. The plowman has lost his sweat, and the green corn hath rotted ere his youth attained a beard." So what does he mean by ere his youth attained a beard, the corn? It hasn't grown enough to have that hairy stuff that sticks out from it when you eat a cob of corn, right? So it doesn't have its hair. It's still so young. It rotted in its youth before it grew into being corn. The ox can't draw its plow because it's so muddy. It can't work. The plowman has lost all his labor. So we've lost crops. We've had flooding and we've had crops lost. The fold stands empty in the drowned field, and crows are fatted with the murrain flock. So the cows and the sheep and other things that were in the fields have all died, and the crows are going around searching for the dead animals that the floods have left. The 9 men's morris is filled up with mud, and the quaint mazes in the wanton green for lack of tread are indistinguishable. The 9 men's morris is a May Day dance, so we can't have our May Day. The human mortals want their winter here. No night is now with hymn or carol blessed. Therefore, she says, the moon, the governess of floods, pale in her anger, washes all the air, that rheumatic diseases do abound. So now we've got disease attacking us through the lens of this climate disruption. And through that distemperature, the climate is distempered, right? It's not moderated. We see the seasons alter. Hoary-headed frosts fall in the fresh lap of the crimson rose. So we have roses coming up, but it's winter and it's freezing. The seasons are so lost in themselves. The spring, the summer, the chiding autumn, angry winter change their wonted liveries. Wanted liveries means accustomed clothes, the outfits that they wear that are typical for their season. So they change their clothes. They don't look like themselves anymore. And the mazed world, by their increase, now knows not which is which. So the mazed world is a labyrinth, it's a maze, and it's also amazed at the horror of this seasonal catastrophe. She ends by saying, because this is a play, so there's actually going to be a plot and action, she says, this same progeny of evils comes from our debate, from our dissension. We are their parents and original. And I think that we might think about ourselves as perhaps the parents and originals of the climate change that we haven't been able to see, whose immensity we can't really cope with or fully understand or even tell stories that are believable about. So I hope that this is just an introduction to some of the issues we'll be talking about today, but I wanted to share what I got out of the readings, none of which I had done before this gathering. So it was a great occasion for me, just as for you, to experience these wonderful texts. And with that, I'm going to pass the microphone to Millery Pollinay, our Associate Dean of Faculty and Academic Affairs and Professor of African American History.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to see you all. Sometimes it's important to start at the ending. Although Zoe Todd concludes with lessons to be learned, I believe the author's article, Relationships, issues an assignment. For me, it's more of an act of assigning duty or responsibility to the reader. The assignment for us, during a time in which many deem environmentally catastrophic, is to interrogate the architecture and to implement the principles of loving accountability and reciprocity, which have been encoded in First Peoples' legal systems and social political affairs. As the author brings us home to Treaty 6 territory in Alberta, Canada, Todd assertively and plainly states that reciprocity, care, accountability, and love are required tools to confront the obstacles of the Anthropocene, of apocalyptic environmental change, thus forcing us to engage seemingly with contradictory ideas and constructs in our current economic, racial, and gendered climate. Love and the law, care and policy, accountability and electoral politics. Reading Todd's article and the way the author invokes violent environmental historical systems and illuminates a consistent involvement of indigenous peoples in environmental activism. What does Todd say? Insistent, present, self-determining, still living indigenous peoples. Reading this piece brought up an old memory of an incredulous story I heard in the early 80s that I later found out was true. About a son of Caribbean immigrants who, after seeing an oil spill in the San Francisco Bay, made the decision to not ride in cars, trains, or buses, any motorized vehicles. He walked. For 22 years he walked. Across the United States and through many parts of Central and South America. 22 years. 17 years of which he vowed to be silent. John Francis is his name. Some have given him the name the Planet Walker. And from what I read, he's still a passionate environmentalist. I'm not an expert on all his politics, nor do I possess at all his fortitude or resoluteness. To be honest, there's a part of me that questions his methods. But I mention him because it's important to see, read, and work with people of color who have historically offered alternative visions of living life in the Anthropocene. Additionally, I mention Francis because of his 17 years of silence, all while getting his doctorate in land management at the University of Wisconsin. With these 17 years of silence, this intense period of listening to others, or what Zoe Todd states as tending to relationships between people, places, and stories. I just encourage you to use these 4 years, and quite frankly, your forever, to listen intently and to tend to the stories and the peoples that bind our communities and peoples around the world. So in the spirit of listening intently, let's turn our attention to our dynamite faculty panel. Professor Peter Anker is a scholar of history of science, ecology, and design, as well as environmental philosophy. He's written a number of well-regarded books on ecology in the British Empire and ecological design, and we're thrilled about his latest book with Professor Mitch Joachim, School of the Earth. I wish I brought it with me to show everyone. School of the Earth, Gallatin Reimagined 2061. School of the Earth was written with Gallatin students and is a vision for what the Gallatin School would be like, should be like, in 2061 at Albert Gallatin's 300th birthday. The new vision for the Gallatin School is complete with visionary images and a model created to educate students and the public that not only is it possible for humans to exist while giving back, but that we can make the planet a better, healthier place for the future as well. Next, we'll have Professor Eugenia Kissin, who's an anthropologist of art whose ethnographic and historical research focuses on the way that things called art come to matter at a nexus of social action, extractive economies, and forms of governance. Kissin is committed to scholarly and political engagement with the histories and futures of contemporary indigenous art in North America. And at Gallatin, her teaching and research interests include contemporary art and agency, critical indigenous philosophies, curatorial practices, visual and sensory research methods, and aesthetics of risk management and refusal. Next, we have Professor Kimberly DaCosta, sociologist and especially interested in the contemporary production of racial boundaries. Her current work studies the advertising industry and the structural, economic, and cultural dimensions of ethnic marketing. Well, actually, before we have the faculty panel, we have Ben Steinfeld, Olivia Wendell, and Andrew Gehring, who will perform a song. Andrew is a senior at Gallatin, whose concentration focuses on acting, music composition, and creative writing. And Olivia is a recent May 2017 graduate of Gallatin, and I believe currently a family coordinator at Lincoln Center. Ben, who will introduce the performance, is an actor, director, and co-founder of the Fiasco Theater and a professor at Gallatin. Thank you.
Stockholm,
1972. As man's impact on earth threatens peace in our time, this is the Declaration of the United Nations. Human rights must be asserted. Yes, they must.
natural resources maintained.
Wildlife must be safeguarded.
Population must be better contained. Oceans must be better protected.
Science must be respected.
Education elevated.
Weapons of mass destruction eliminated.
Economic inequality will be no more once richer nations help the poor. Rio, 1992. To build on the unrealized goals of Stockholm, we have made a declaration of basic principles and an agreement to consider 40 recommendations and an agreement on the importance of reducing emissions with no specific commitment regarding the level of emissions or any future reduction of emissions. And in addition, a commission to help the condition of emissions with no power of enforcement. Copenhagen, 2009.
This is the agreement that has been ratified. The agreement recognizes the scientific view that increase in global temperature should not exceed 2 degrees Celsius.
Countries will individually commit to implement emission targets on a voluntary basis. Any collective targets for the future have been disregarded.
These agreements are not legal. These agreements are not binding.
The parties in participation do not necessarily agree with the content, but only take note of the accords.
The timeline for compliance is unspecified. We will meet again next year. The polls show 57% of Americans think something's happening to the climate.
91% think it's somewhat serious.
40% think it's somewhat important. 41% think it's
that it's
over-exaggerated.
21% think that it's under-exaggerated.
44% think that it should be more of a priority.
But not if it costs too much.
Less than healthcare or the economy.
36% think it's caused by humans.
Or maybe 47%.
Or 51% maybe think it's a combination of human and natural causes.
50% favor regulation.
20%
Or maybe less.
Or more.
seek action.
20% believe the snow they shoveled last winter precludes any chance of climate change. 20% aggressively reject catastrophic outcomes as a possibility.
60% categorize themselves as tuned out and confused. With a 6-point margin of error.
Thank you. God, you can drink a lot of water. All right, so am I on? All right, everyone. Welcome to Gallatin. Hello. This is when you're supposed to say hello, professor, or hello back. Hello. All right. So my name is Peter Anker. Thanks for the nice introduction, Professor Polanyi, and thanks you, Dean Warford. I'm gonna start with where I spent my summer. How's that? And the question I would like to, can everyone hear me, by the way, over there? Yeah. The question I would like to ask you is like, how does this environment influence you? Has this environment determined who I am? Now, you guys spent also your summers in a certain types of environment, grow up in a certain place. I'm from Norway. This is kind of where I'm from. And how does that determine me? How does that, make me? So you do Google the stereotypes in Norwegian. We are modest, somber, introvert, blonde-haired, and here rational and boring. And one thing you will learn at Gallatin that rational is not boring. Rational is the most exciting thing. Anyway, and rustic and sophisticated, that's probably true, and I'm the fish eaters. You can bribe me with a fish. Anyway, when we look at the stereotypes from all around you, you can also ask yourself, has the environment determined who you are? Is the Californian and the Vermontians, are they, determined by their environments? And the same for the stereotypes around the world. Are these type of stereotypes? These stereotypes are based on serious, type of research on what's out there on the web. Are these type of stereotypes determined from the environment you're in? Now, the guy who sort of come up with that theory that the environment determines who you are is Hippocrates. We don't know what the guy looked like. We don't even know if just one guy. Who knows? There have been many guys, probably many guys. And he's depicted in different ways throughout century and tells us more about the different centuries than him. It seems that everyone agrees that he looks like some sort of, cool hipster dude from Brooklyn with his beard. Anyway, his book, Air, Waters, and Places, is one of the most influential books in the Western canon and Western civilization, in the sense that it has really laid the groundwork for how especially Europeans think about themselves and people who are not from Europe. This is where he's from Kos, it's a little island here. And that might look like the periphery today, but back then it was definitely in the center of civilization, if you like, if that's an appropriate word, because waterways would go like this. And everyone was traveled by water, so he will be fairly well accompanied to how people were around the world. He would sit behind this tree, and if you go to Kos, they will tell that Hippocrates was actually sitting under this tree. But that can't be true because only 500 years old. But what's interesting here is that he will sit in the public domain, right in the center of the city. And from back then till today, it is an aspiration of academia, including Gallatin, to make our lectures, our talks, our knowledge as part of the public domain, be part of the public. Certainly my aspiration, I think I can speak of the entire faculty and the dean to say we want to reach out, we want our knowledge not to be exclusive, but to be like Hippocrates here sitting in the middle of the city. If you look at the map from the time, Kos will be about here, in the middle of the world. And you can recognize some of the names that you saw in your reading: Scythia, Europe, Libya, Asia. Noticed here that he would describe everything from the north being cold and people being cold, Norwegians being cold, and people in the south being warm, and people from the west being dry and small, noting small, and people from the east being dry, being wet and moisturous and so on. Now, this will frame how they think about themselves. Notice that Kos is in the middle. So this is like the ideal climate, and everything else is wrong. Too much of this. This will sort of continue with Pliny the Elder. Now, Kos is not in the middle. It's Rome is in the middle, and everything which is not Rome is not ideal anymore. These images are taken from the Nuremberg Chronicle, actually images of a book we own here at NYU. You can go to the library, the Fales Library, you can check it out, white gloves on, and you can look at this amazing book. And what Pliny here is being copied by everyone. And these are people who are living south of Sahara, Somalia kind of area today. They are, because of climate, they are not normal people. They are monsters, right? So here you kind of see the birth of scientific racism, scientific prejudices of people who are not from Rome. And the further away from Rome, the worse they are, kind of, or stranger, or less good, notable. This idea would continue with Louis Buffon, very influential natural historian, French. Now, Cousins will be in the center, Rome will be in the center, Paris will be in the center of the ideal climate. And everything in the north, south, east, west will be not good enough, including North America, where most of you are from. He will have all kind of places of people in North America. It's not a good place to be. It will be too dry, and things will be very small in North America. Animals, so you go out hunting, you will not get big animals to hunt because of climate. And it's very dangerous to travel there because, you know, the climate is not ideal for you. Now, a guy who was approached, discussed it before, was Thomas Jefferson, my hero. He would say, before, he was in Paris at the time, writing in Paris, talking with Buffon on a sort of bi-weekly basis as a sort of ambassador figure on behalf of Virginia. And he will try to promote people to come to Virginia. He wanted immigrants, very different today, of course, but back then, immigrants, we want people to come to Virginia, and Virginia, you can live in Virginia, you can adapt to Virginia. Climate is not dangerous in Virginia, and animals are not small. And to prove Buffon wrong, this is an important moment in the history of science, he would ask his soldiers in Virginia, go out in the forest, shoot the biggest deer you can find, stuff it, and send it to Paris. And you can see there's statistics here. Where's the, no, this one here. The elk. This is how, you know, in Europe it's very small, in America it's very big, right? So that to prove to go to America is good. You do well, and let's see. How do I do this? Stuck. Oh, please. Can you next slide, please? Oops, I don't know what happened. How are we doing with the slides? Friends up there. Well, we'll wait for the next slide. Jefferson, I think, when he used the word freedom, very important word in my world and your world too, it was, and in the US Constitution, it really meant freedom from the idea of climate determinism. Whatever climate you're born in, you can be a full human being. Doesn't matter what climate you're from. Doesn't matter that you are in a climate that is foreign to you. You can be a full human being. You have all the possibilities of it. Anyway, I had an image of that huge elk with me. It's a huge elk. Buffon, poor guy, he got this big elk. Let's see, you can get it. Nope. And so imagine this huge elk there up on the screen. Buffon got this big elk, and everyone was, the whole Paris, all the rich people, aristocrats, whatnot, would come and admire this big elk. And from that comes the expression, everything is big in America. Right? It proved Buffon wrong. It proved Pliny wrong. It proved Hippocrates wrong. Right? We can adapt in America. Oh well. The next slides, I can, we can go through imagination. So he's the one who sort of endorses climate adaptation. In America, we can adapt. America, we're not determined by climate. That's kind of his big message. Now, today, there's also climate determinism is still around. I want to show an image of a guy called Ellison Huntington. He wrote a book about climate and civilization, European book, written kind of right at that crucial moment in Europe where things were sort of First World War, going into Second World War. And he would say people who are from the, oh, there's the elk, right? There's the elk, there it is. It's still there on display in Paris. You can look at it. And they're very proud of it. It says here, gift from, Jefferson and so on. The whole history is there. Here's me with the elk, the selfie. Anyone here from Virginia? Go Virginia. Hey, welcome to Gallatin. Virginia for lovers. All right. So this is the map I want to show you. Climate determinism, very typical for a period, a dark period in Europe. Notice that here is a world map of climatic energy. And there's a lot of good energy there, right? And here is a world map of civilization under here. And the argument of the whole book, a very influential book, is that only these areas of the world can really be civilized, right? And these areas of the world cannot really be civilized. And with that, a type of scientific endorsement of these type of prejudices and racisms which we are still struggling with today. We are still having problem with the clicker. This is an example of climate determinism today. Jay Darmon, one of my least favorite scholars. He's so popular that I can say that. He's in his book, Collapse, he's talking about the Easter Islands, Peru, and the Maya civilization all collapsed because of climate. They were determined to collapse. They could not do it. They collapsed because of climate. Climate changes explains everything that happened. And with that comes the image of New York City too, that the water will come up. We are determined to collapse as a civilization to this place. We cannot do anything about it. This is kind of an echo of Hippocrates of climate determinism. I don't like this image. It also had about echo of today's news, right? What's happening in Houston. Now, I think we can adapt. I really think so. I think this is a much better image of the future. Here, this is by Architecture Research Office, DLN Studio. Here we have adapted. Here we make marshlands, we have oyster beds, we've done all kind of cool stuff to adapt to a wetter climate and higher ocean rings. This building, and I'm very proud to say that if you go walk in the door over there, you will see this sign, which proves that we as a school, we have actually walked the walk in terms of adapting to the climate. We have made the greenest building on NYU, as far as I know. How's that? Yeah. So, I take some pride in this because we have more work to do at NYU. And I asked my students, how can we adapt as a school? How can we, adapt? How can we, in the spirit of Jefferson, say, no, we're gonna survive with climate change? And this is one, Leland Sutton. He's going to graduate in this fall. This is how we imagine the street outside here in the future. This is Hannah Stern, who just graduated, very talented. She imagined the future that we will have, here you see solar cells, here you see vegetables and greenery growing on our building. This is how we can adapt as a house, as a building. We made a School of the Earth, Gallatin Reimagined, so that we can, this is a film made by students, you can go on YouTube and watch it, how students imagined that the school in 2061 will be adapting to climate change. We made a model of what our buildings will look like. You guys are sitting in here right now, aren't you? And this is sort of a new building, so on. And we published a book. I'm showing it so you can all buy it, but no one is earning money on it, so don't worry about that. But it's a vision written by all the students about how we can adapt in the spirit of Jefferson, the spirit of Virginia, in the spirit of so on. There's all kind of suggestions here on the ways what we can do as a school. And with that optimistic note, on a very dark period in terms of climate change, I probably went over my time, didn't I? Yeah, sorry.
So, oh good, it works. Good morning. I'm Eugenia Kissen, and I'd like to begin on a slightly different tack by acknowledging the ancestral and unceded territories of the Lenni Lenape that we are all sitting on. This kind of recognition is becoming much more customary at NYU, and to me, it's a really important foundation for thinking about how climate justice is inseparable from Indigenous political thought and rights movements, including movements specifically about the environment. A spoken recognition in this way can be an action that materializes relationships between peoples, lands, and waters. So first, taking seriously what Indigenous scholars, including the anthropologist Zoe Todd, whose work you read for today, argue about thinking differently about our relationships on this land, I'll also tell you that I am a settler. of Ashkenazi Jewish and Northern European ancestry, and that I was born on Treaty 13 lands, which is the part of Turtle Island or North America that's now known as Toronto, Canada. It's on the shores of Lake Ontario, which is now connected to the Trent-Severn waterway that moves through all of Leanne Simpson's poems that you read. Although in this historic map, it wasn't yet connected. The canal was just proposed along this dotted line. So this way of stating who I am and where I am from emphasizes legal relationships, intimate geographies, and non-human entities that are not usually part of an academic biography. When I say I'm a settler, it also foregrounds a particular history. It acknowledges that my grandparents came to stay, and that I continue to inhabit a social and political structure that shapes the power to govern, map, and extract resources. A structure that's deeply unsettled and disquieted by continuing Indigenous political presence. In these historical and also intimate ways, colonialism is another force that's entangled with imperialism and capitalism, the ones that Ghosh identifies as the forces that shape our great derangement. From this perspective, the hydraulic lift locks, canals, hydro dams, and cannibal spirits of the Wendigo that animate Leanne Simpson's poems are infrastructures of settler colonial occupation, the improbable that has already happened for the Anishinaabe. This is the Lock 21 on the Trent-Severn waterway that I'm showing. And although it doesn't look very sinister, it's believed by many non-Indigenous people to be haunted, as the uncomfortable political reality of Indigenous presence is often buried in our stories and our myths to return as ghosts that bedevil property owners who dare to build on native land. Think of, in this way, The Shining, a lot of other horror movies, or James Fenimore Cooper's novels. For me, this form of a national uncanny, to use literary theorist Renee Berglund's terms, for these haunting Indigenous ghosts that return, really augments and also complicates this sense of the uncanny that Ghosh wishes to see in our stories, that urges us to see the Anthropocene as a world of insistent, inescapable continuities, animated by forces that are nothing if not inconceivably vast. Vast and also intimate. The clean water in our wombs and breasts, Simpson writes, is the same clean water in the rivers and lakes. An image that enacts the kinds of loving accountability that Todd wishes to see, and that I think Ghosh is after as well. Part of the problem of fiction for him, although he doesn't quite put it in these terms, is that we think it doesn't hold us accountable in the same ways as nonfiction or science fiction. But the kinds of language that we use to talk about the Anthropocene matter a great deal to invoking these kinds of accountability without depending solely on authentic belief or personal morality or individual consumer choices. Rather, Ghosh and Simpson are after a language or languages that can inspire collective political action from diverging premises. So thinking from the premises of Simpson's poems, the we that Ghosh invokes for rhetorical effect is actually a bit complicated by the particular improbabilities and unbearable truths of living on Indigenous land. Simpson's we in her list poem, Ngojiwanong, which is the Indigenous word name for Peterborough, where this lift lock is, a series of points blocking the lift locks in a parody of mild bureaucratic regrets. Do you remember that poem? We regret, every section begins with that. That we is a much more particular one that stems from refusal rather than recognition. From an Indigenous theory perspective, which is what I'm trying to center here, refusal also matters a great deal to these aesthetics of the Anthropocene, partly because it reverses our assumptions of unfettered access to lands, bodies, and knowledge, assumptions of mastery that have led us to our present crisis. I also use the word mastery quite deliberately because I think that there is a bit of blindness on Ghosh's part to the ways in which an uncanny experience of nature and kinship ties are differently obligated for women and also across multiple modernities. By contrast, Simpson's poems are addressed from aunties, grandmothers, nieces, daughters, and kin. And in the desire for decolonial love, which is the title of this collection that she borrows from Dominican American author Junot Diaz, to refer to love that refuses colonial extractive logics. As some of you noticed in the responses that I read, Simpson's privileging of the Anishinaabe indigenous language terms also works as a kind of refusal, limiting our access through these partial translations, while at the same time, I think, connecting with a lot of different audiences and different publics who come to this text from their own experiences. Following these aesthetics of refusal and connection, I want to turn finally to what Ghosh identifies as less logocentric forms. Oops, clicker is very sensitive. Okay, so less logocentric forms, so visual art as a means of representing these contested landscapes. Ghosh argues that aesthetic preferences are partly to blame for our failure to represent and acknowledge climate change. He writes, global warming's resistance to the arts begins deep underground in the recesses where organic matter undergoes the transformations that makes it possible for us to devour the sun's energy in fossilized forms. He goes on, think of the vocabulary that is associated with these substances: naphtha, bitumen, petroleum, tar, and fossil fuels. No poet or singer could make these syllables fall lightly on the ear. Yet there's also a beauty to these materials and their heavy transformations, and one that I think is well suited to telling these kinds of more complicated stories that we need to take stock of our many complicities and also solidarities. A dress by Wendy Redstar, whose vinyl hide draws together different economies to sensuous effect, hugging the body. Marianne Nicholson's painted oil spill, its dark formline edges pressing toward marine animals rendered in traditional Northwest Coast formline style, whose eyes are blinded by coins. And finally, Nicholas Gallatin's ceramic riot gear, mounted crucifix-like in a ghastly installation of the complex forms of white martyrdom, native terror, and hybrid religion at sites of protest like Standing Rock. Here too, the iridescent sheen of oil is visible just on the surface of the porcelain. These artists' interpretations of the present oil encounter tell stories of extractive kinship amidst connection. They reject a pure and prior indigenous environmentalism. There's no undying the hide. The oil spill takes on its formline motif, and we are also reflected in the surface sheen if you see this work in person. Now, I'm not a writer of novels or of poetry, and perhaps you aren't either, but you are about to do a lot of academic writing. And you can do so with an ear that is trained to notice these inescapable continuities and other kinds of intimacies. Bravely notice and write things in the ugly subterranean language of naphtha, bitumen, petroleum, and tar, as well as political histories, presents, and futures, to move your own stories into relationship with other beings. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'd like to start with a story. On October 29th, 2012, Glenda Moore, a 40-year-old nurse, was, like many New Yorkers, preparing as best she could for the impact of Superstorm Sandy. Glenda's husband, Damien, a city sanitation worker, had been called into work to help with the crisis. Alone with her children, 4-year-old Connor and 2-year-old Brandon, Glenda decided she'd be safer sheltering with family in Brooklyn, so she packed up the kids and drove toward the Verrazano Bridge. When her car stalled in the rising floodwaters on Father Cappuccino Boulevard, Glenda managed to release her sons from their car seats and exit the vehicle, hoping to make it to a nearby house for refuge. But with fast rising waters and 2 toddlers in her arms, she could only manage to reach a large tree and hope it would protect them. It could not. Eventually, a powerful wave crashed over the trio, dragging Connor and Brandon into the rushing river that Father Cappuccino Boulevard had become. Frantic, Glenda managed to scale an embankment and reach a nearby house. She banged on the door, screaming for help, and asked her neighbor to call 911. Alan, this neighbor, says he was afraid that the man at the door was trying to rob him. "I'm not going to open the door," he would tell a neighbor the next day. "I'm not crazy." And he didn't open the door. Instead, he barricaded himself in front of it, leaving Glenda to seek help elsewhere. She didn't find any. And so Glenda spent that awful night of 90-mile-per-hour winds and torrential rain, this region's worst storm in living memory, outside, huddled on the doorstep, without her children. Connor and Brandon would be found a few days later, just at the end of the boulevard, their lifeless little bodies within a few yards of each other. The story of Alan, Glenda, Connor, and Brandon is deeply shocking. Unthinkable, even. I tell it here because it illustrates so many of the themes of our authors. It is our great derangement writ small, or rather writ local. And like the globalized phenomenon Amitav Ghosh writes about, that which is unthinkable and seems to make no sense has a logic to it. Ghosh locates the roots of our great derangement, climate change and our refusal to prevent or try to stop it, in the practices of capitalism and empire, and the habits of mind that produce and perpetuate them. His book is an examination of the contradictory and counterintuitive implications of each of these for how we deal or not with the effects of climate change and the coming catastrophes. Like many climate change-related disasters, Hurricane Sandy was and still is described as unprecedented and highly improbable. A storm that met city planners and residents alike unprepared, convinced that losing one's life in a hurricane was something that happened elsewhere. A common belief that, some analysts claim, reflects an innate human ability to prepare for rare events. Ghosh is skeptical of this reading of history, arguing instead that our inability to believe the worst will happen is a relatively recent development, an aspect of the unconscious patterns of thought or common sense that gained ascendancy with the rise of scientific theories and practices informed by statistics and probability that produced a growing faith in the regularity of bourgeois life. In other words, we have become unable to prepare for rare events, in no small part because our calculations of risk deem them unlikely. The calculations of risk that underlie our view of Sandy as unprecedented and improbable are stories about how the world works. All stories, Ghosh points out, produce a way of seeing that is always at once a way of not seeing. The stories we tell or fail to tell shape how we act or do not in profound ways. So what common sense, what story was Alan relying upon that made it make sense to him to refuse to render aid to Glenda Moore? What calculations of risk, informed by what logics and practices, was he making when he barricaded himself against the door? Alan's fear of a stranger robbing him exemplifies many of the trends in the United States that social analysts have documented for decades. In our highly mobile, hyper-individualized consumer culture, we have more stuff and less time. We work more for less money and are far less likely to engage in our communities than our parents and grandparents. Many of us don't even know our neighbors' names. In an age of pervasive economic, political, and ecological insecurity, social trust is down, a sense of perceived threat is up. But how do the questions we ask to make sense of the unthinkable change when we learn that Alan is a white man, Glenda is a black woman? Does Alan's story about fear of being robbed sound different when we realize the stranger he says he feared was black, that the man he thought was attempting to rob him was a woman? Or when we learn that Glenda's car stalled in Staten Island, the whitest and least diverse borough in New York City, in a highly segregated neighborhood with 73% white and only 3% black residents? Do our questions shift or merely multiply when we learn that other residents, too, refused to help Glenda, reportedly saying to the 5'3" Moore when she asked them to call 911, "I don't know you," and closing the door? My point is that when we take into account a context beyond the facts of the weather that night, this story of climate change writ local becomes somewhat less unprecedented, improbable, and unthinkable. For while losing one's life in a hurricane is in fact a rare event in New York City, death by racialized indifference, to say nothing of outright violence, is not. Unprecedented, improbable, unthinkable, or regularized, patterned, predictable. Just as a contextualization of this localized example changes the questions we ask and the story we tell about its logic, the same is true for climate change writ large. When 3 500-year storms occur in as many years, as is happening in Houston as we speak, and in Mumbai and Kathmandu and Dhaka, we need to stop claiming surprise. And Zoe Todd reminds us, we need to stop describing our catastrophe as unthinkable, when, quote, over the last 500 years, indigenous peoples faced and face the end of worlds with the violent incursion of colonial ideologies and actions. So what do we do? What do you do? In the writing of some disillusioned, exhausted, recovering environmentalists, the ones that I find the most helpful, the message is that the scale of the problem is too large, and it's too late anyway to forestall the devastating impacts of climate change. It's not that winter is coming, they tell us. Winter is here. And for the most marginalized among us, winter has been here. It's easy to feel entirely overwhelmed, isolated, and unsure of what to do next. But despair can be productive and need not be an end state. Because devastating climate impacts are irreversible, the only questions left are how we will cope with the end of the world as we know it. And just as importantly, what possibly better world we might create from it. What's clear, though, is that dealing with the unthinkable requires more than addressing your personal consumption choices. Ditching the SUV and recycling more is not nothing, but it's not enough. You could pursue a personal politics of the armed lifeboat like Alan did, jealously guarding his resources while trying to keep the stranger at bay. Or more commonly, devote yourself to building your own personal lifeboat, you know, your career and your bank account, hoping that will save you and maybe your immediate family. I hope not. I prefer Zoe Todd's advice and those that have gone before. And I'll use a quote that's been said a few times today. Reciprocity, love, accountability, and care, she writes, are tools we require to face uncertain futures and the ends of worlds as we know them. Tending to relationships between people, place, and stories will be crucial as we face the challenge of the Anthropocene. To cope with climate change, we're going to have to talk about more than the weather. We're going to have to talk and listen about all the systemic injustices, from racial profiling to economic austerity that turns so-called natural disasters into human catastrophes. We're going to have to ditch more than our consumer stuff. We're going to have to ditch our consumerist values that make both things and people disposable. We're going to have to talk about what we owe each other on the basis of our shared humanity, and to work to make human community meaningful right where we are. So that stories like that of Connor and Brandon, Glenda and Alan, aren't simply imagined to be, but truly are unthinkable. Thank you.
time, we know more. Okay.
Hello. All right, here we are again.
We're back.
Yeah, my God. So this is from a musical called Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson, which, believe it or not, before Hamilton, there was another musical about early American life, the founding of the country. And I was in this show. I was part of the original cast of this show, and I learned a lot working on it. And it was a very Gallatin-esque experience to take real ideas and real history and real questions and real politics that are in the world and try to construct an artistic response to those pieces that also can be sort of interrogated at the level of process. And this was a song that was sung at the end of the show by the band leader that tried to sort of take stock of what it meant to have to view part of American destiny and manifest destiny as involving the sort of domination of other people and the elimination of other identities, and ultimately an attempt to sort of control land as a metaphor for what the sort of underbelly of the founding of the country is about. So this is Second Nature.
The grass grows a prairie, a wilderness across the continent, and we take it, we clear it out and make it in our image.
The backyards, the driveways, the covered wagons rushing through the high plains and motels, the canyon, they make it in our image.
And what was it for, this country? The farms and the blood across the prairie. The nation we become as we build a second nature. No, no, no.
No, no, no.
No, no, no.
No, no, no.
The rivers run and parking lots, the endless fields and cities.
We make them, replace them with all our dreams of the future.
And what was it for? The swimming pools, the highways, the ball games in the dusk on the battlefields. A time we were so foolish and so young. No, no, no.
No, no, no.
No, no, no.
No, no, no.
No, 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 no.
No, no, no. The grass grows, we take it, we want it, it's second nature to us.
Thank you again to Ben, Olivia, and at this point, we're going to bring back our panelists, faculty panelists. And I want you to take this moment to think of some questions that you want to ask the faculty. here's your moment before we head off into our groups. What questions do you have of the text and of their presentations?
All right, we count on you. You have questions and comments, issues, debates. We don't want this to be we talk at you. All right?
Sure. Sure.
Doesn't like me. Oh, now it's working. All right. So something I noticed when reading Ghosh's book is that he seemed to have a very, very narrow definition of the word novel, because he didn't think that anything that was like really anything but realistic fiction in like a very particular sense qualified. And I don't know, I was wondering if you thought that he was kind of shifting words to fit his statement, or if you were okay with it and why. That question made more sense in my head.
Maybe I'll start with that. I think you're completely on target. He's really trying to talk about a kind of elitism of of European and American writing in the 20th century, and he's excluding piles of things. He's saying that these are the things that were valued according to his reading and theory. So you might well disagree with him, but one of the things I think he tries to do at the end is to come back and say, but actually this was really wrong. Even my own fiction that participated in certain modernist assumptions was wrong. And he, in a sense, is saying that the writers that were excluded, including science fiction, were actually more important or more together in the ways that he was valuing in the book. But I think you're completely right. There's an argument in this book that he's having with the history of literary evaluation in the last century up till now. And I think you're completely right to question the narrowness of how he frames that issue. And one of the things he does say early on, which I was struck by, especially given Leanne Simpson's writing, is he says, well, lots of poets have done this. So he sort of says, but novels, we need novels. That's where we're going to imagine these things. But he's not talking about poetry or plays or whatever, which is interesting because he's a novelist. So he's sort of like, well, this part that I do is the really important thing. And so the fact that it doesn't have, the kinds of fiction writing that I think it should is the thing that we should count on. I thought that was a very interesting exclusion and sort of weird because novels can also be poetic and poetry. There's that opposition isn't a right one. So anyway, your question is really good, but I'd love to hear what I wondered about this issue too from the beginning, so I wondered what other people thought about that. If anyone else wants to jump in on it. No. How about one of you guys? Yeah.
Well, I think that he purposely frames the novel as having a very narrow form. To emphasize the modernist way of writing a novel that is centered on a narrative that regards human agency and morality as being central to the form.
Right.
So I think that he's saying that having that be the way that we have all novels, or most novels, take shape is a narrow-minded way of writing. I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. Have another question, or shall we continue? There's one.
So it might not be like a question, more like a comment, and I think it's something that
is worth bringing up and worth discussing. It's very interesting to me, the very beginning of Ghosh's book, he talked about culture. He says that culture is a force that generates ideas, desires, which I think it's interesting, but I think it's also very narrow because I personally think it's desires that generates culture. The whole book is talking about all these, to me, is like Western culture, because I'm from China. All these, capitalism, / communism, imperialism, individualism, all of that is the culture that he thinks is the root for this great derangement. But what I'm wondering is, what is the desires that created all these cultures that made us end up in this place? I think that's something that we need to address instead of blaming all these already existing isms and beliefs and ways of living. So that's what I'm thinking, and also like, cause I guess he's from like a Western background, and even though now China is under communism, all of that, and there are a lot of Western influence, but from my understanding of ancient Chinese culture, there are a lot of things that are just not, it's just different. It's almost opposite of what is described in the book. For example, he's talking about fiction and in Western culture, in like Western literature, Shakespeare and all of those fiction drama writers are what's on the top of the literary world, while in Chinese, it's poets that are on top of the literary world. And all Chinese religions and cultures value nature more than they value human societies. So that's something that I want to bring up with everybody, because I think that's something that's missing, because climate change is a human condition that everybody has to face. So we shouldn't just talk about one side of the planet, that we should consider all and maybe draw some nourish from all kinds of culture and all kinds of society and all kinds of knowledge to make us, more knowledgeable and more capable of getting over this, I guess, difficulties and stuff like that. So.
So thank you for your comments, and I think you're picking up on something very important about how he's using culture. And I don't know how many people know this, but Ghosh was actually trained as a social anthropologist at Oxford before he became the celebrated novelist he is. So he's working from this very particular disciplinary frame in many ways that he might not even be aware of. And it's always useful for us as interdisciplinary scholars to mark and notice that when people are speaking from their own disciplinary position and almost assuming another kind of we in that as well. I think that he adopts the sort of sweeping rhetoric that he does because this is meant as a polemical text. This isn't, this is not a sort of small, fine-grained academic analysis. This is meant to point out very broad trends, which often results in, I agree with you, quite sweeping generalizations about culture and also individual cultures, right? When he does bring in examples, especially from cultural contexts that he's less familiar with. So I think that it's your instinct to interrogate that is exactly right. Does anyone else want to pick up on?
I just want to say a couple of words about China. I'm so happy that you brought the Chinese perspective in. China is today the nation that really takes climate change head on. America is not. America is kind of the bad guy in the group, right? So I think America, and especially North America, has a lot to learn from China and the Chinese perspective on climate change. So I'm very happy that you brought that in. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a bit about the way that you framed your question. you were opposing culture to desire, and I'm presuming a kind of innate human desire that generates culture. And I don't necessarily think that the search for origins is really going to help us here, because we are embodied beings, but we also exist in cultures, and these things are inseparable. But what I think you're pointing out is that in some ways, I mean, it's implicit and explicit in some ways in the text. It's about how different forms of power get harnessed to produce the kinds of economies and social structures, our families, our laws, etc., that have shaped the kinds of violences that we're dealing with now, and not just here, but globally. So even if the cultural context is different, and we need to pay attention to that, if we get stuck in these conversations about a search for origins to the problem, I think we're going to quickly find that we understand this is a problem everywhere, right? And searching for that origin isn't going to save us in terms of some innate human desire. Because if that's the case, then how do you change innate human desire?
So we have there's one there, several hands up.
I just want to say thank you, first of all, to the panelists and the singers for the contributions to today's convocation. But I have a question for either of the two parties. I guess we heard some of the statistics in one of the pieces that we heard, but I think we're well aware of the fact that there is still a substantial portion of the American populace, it seems, that will not accept the statistical or scientific evidence that's put forth on climate change. And it seems that there's nothing really that can be easily given to them, or that can be easily explained, that would change their opinions on this. And as the next generation coming forward in all of this, I'm curious what your proposition is, or what you propose that we do to mitigate this kind of mentality going forward.
I might just say one thing very briefly. I didn't feel it was easy to articulate this about Ghosh, but I did feel that his efforts to try to talk about how we don't understand immensity, that the scale problem overwhelms us, is somehow helpful in thinking about this issue of people's resistance to understanding what's happening. So that isn't an answer to you, but I felt that it was his sense that it's about mystery, that there's a kind of mysterious, uncanny, powerful sense that somewhere in our beings we know is happening, but which we nonetheless hold off, that is somehow important to this very important political question that you're raising. This is not a pragmatic answer, but that's just a starting point. That's part of why he's trying to evoke a kind of feeling in his book, even if some parts of it are exaggerated or polemical, to give that sense of how the scale is so much bigger. But it's not really an answer, but that was part of what I was hoping to try to get at. Peter, you might have.
Well, I have one easy answer, and that's education. Right? That's why you guys are here. The only thing I can do as a scholar is to keep on educating, and devoting my life to that. So that's like one answer. There's a complex kind of answer too, but I think it's important to have that kind of one-word education above you as a lodestar in thinking about that issue.
I think that's right, but in addition, you can't wait for people to get it. I mean, it's a matter of politics and organizing and working around that at this point. I mean, because if we wait till everyone agrees with us, who believe that this is real, then we're left at their mercy. And so that organizing, making our communities bigger, broader, more responsive to people on the ground is what we need to do.
And I think part of the purpose of the margin of error song, I don't know if Ben is still here, is he? I think he probably isn't. But part of the purpose of that song is to suggest that our statistical methods of measuring what people think are ridiculous, and and to the extent that they create the things they describe, they're even worse. So one question is, how can we overcome, escape from, redo this power of polling and what it does? And I think that song does a beautiful job of showing that. We all know that it has to do with how the questions are asked. But the bottom line is that these polls are used to control and direct political things. So that's another area to think a lot. I hope the next generation will be focused a lot on how to overcome this particular, I think, very problematic aspect of our political life. Do you have it?
Part of this, and I want to turn this back to you in a minute, but I think part of this is also articulating these things using different languages, so beyond statistics, as you're saying, but also beyond science. And I'm very curious what you all thought of the section on politics where Ghosh puts a great deal of faith in religion and organized religion as a collective force, whether you want to agree with him that that is a site perhaps where significant numbers of people can be brought together on these issues. Are there any thoughts on that?
There's a hand in the back there.
When I was reading Ghosh's work, it certainly seemed that it quite quickly devolved into an attack on neoliberalism and borderline collectivist propaganda. And I was wondering whether surely one would assume that the attributes that contributed to progress, such as neoliberalism and capitalism, simply cannot be rejected, because once they're rejected, the world that we would see would be truly unrecognizable, I believe much more unrecognizable than the world after climate change. Hence, perhaps collectivism and the rejection of everything which contributed to civilization is not the answer. And such radical attempts would merely worsen the situation rather than help us deal with climate change.
Maybe let's get a couple. That's a good idea.
Raise your hands high if you got it.
There's one in the back. There's one in the back there.
Whoever has.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think a lot of why Ghosh goes towards religion is because as human beings in like American culture, we're oriented towards things that we can personify, and personifying climate change is kind of difficult. Like in indigenous culture, the reason that nature is such an important thing is that you can almost personify it in the sense of a god, but you can't do that with climate change. And the fact that religious leaders can sort of put a human face to that problem is what brings people to pay more attention to it and to try to fix it, because then it connects back to them. Then there's like actual consequences, human consequences that they see.
I think that Ghosh looks towards religion because like he feels like he can trust it more than politics, because in his book he was talking about how the country's divided, but then there's also like the military and the government that knows that climate change is coming, and they're doing stuff to like try to combat it without anybody really like knowing about it. And then he also talks about how he feels like democracy in like basically like the United States here is like gone, and that it's not really real. And then he also says that like the problems that we're tackling now, such as sexism and racism and all those other things, are kind of irrelevant and are like cause a big distraction, and we should be focusing on climate change. So there's so much things going on and like stuff happening in secret that like it's kind of hard to understand what's really happening and if we do acknowledge climate change or not.
A couple more, and then we'll have a
A couple hands in the back too that have been up for a while.
perhaps what makes climate change, for those who believe in it, so real, which is we can see it happening as seasons change, and wherever you are, in Costa Rica, rain doesn't come anymore. And in a country that requires so much on rain to develop energy, that is a large problem because the energy sources don't build up. I wrote about that in the convocation. But perhaps the same reason for why we believe in it is the same reason that they don't. It's such a large issue, and it's something humans crave control, and that's not something that you can't control climate change. And it's an issue that seems so large that it's scary to think about the consequences that would occur, and that's a reason for why people not believing in it is easier than believing in it and feeling useless, as in what could we do about it. That could be a very large reason why people choose not to believe in climate change regardless of what they face.
I'm gonna go in the back. Question in the back. Someone has the mic.
Oh, okay. I got the mic a while ago, and I just wanted to make a comment about the man in front of me's comment. I thought it was very interesting because he brought up a point of view that hasn't really been spoken about yet, and I think something interesting in the book is that it does seem to be rejecting capitalism as a whole, and near the end of the book, it seems to indoctrinate fear into us a little bit, saying that, like doomsaying our culture and doomsaying the future of our world. And I think on the same vein that he was speaking about, instead of indoctrinating fear into us, we need to look towards the positive of what we can do and how we can change things for the better. Like the first speaker, you gave some really interesting alternatives to ways we could change transportation or the way we have our culture set up in the future. And I think that that is what we should be focusing on instead of the fear and the doomsaying of our culture and the rejection of capitalism.
Why don't we have you guys respond to some of those? And then
We've got one person really actively waving a hand in the back there. So we'll give one more. This gentleman was standing up with the...
Thank you. So I'm a longtime environmentalist. I'm from New Hampshire, and I believe Gosh's main point was on the culture aspects of things. And even personally, growing up as an environmentalist living in New Hampshire, I was frequently asked, like, why would you go to NYU? Like, that's the opposite of the woods. And my own personal reason was the same as Gosh's, because I believe New York City is the heart of the culture of America, and essentially a lot of the Western world as well. And even just like, I think part of the reason our group is reading this book is, especially as like artists and other various forms of performing, and Gosh points to claiming the avant-garde and how their impact can affect the culture that we have. And the culture also affects capitalism and what we portray in America as the good life. So I believe it's important for the culture, especially the impact that our class of 300 people is going to have, to kind of shape that to be one of more of a life in balance with nature, and one where we take the direction of our society now, which is very, very clearly not sustainable, and kind of use that collective culture and the impact we can have between each other to move our society in the direction where we can have a sustainable future and all live happily together.
So we still have urgent hands up. What should we do, Mallory? Should we?
I would love a response from
some responses first, and you're next after we do some responses to this round, okay? I promise.
Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, we can't go in depth here now, but I mean, I think it's important to underscore a couple of things. One of the fundamental logics informing our current economic paradigm is that you can have perpetual growth on a finite planet. And you can't, actually. And so the questions, it's not about keeping things the same. The way you framed it was capitalism versus communism. We can't keep things the same if we want to mitigate, if we have a chance of mitigating the problems that climate change poses. But it's important to understand there are different kinds of capitalism, right? We don't have to have the kind of rapacious capitalism that you have grown up in which there is no strong social safety net for people, where we've inculcated a belief in this winner-take-all society that is actually the best way to organize things. That when people suffer misfortune, it's a failure, their failure, and their failure is their fault. And therefore, we don't have to help them because they screwed up. I mean, that's the kind of cultural stew that many of us are living in and take for granted. That's not how it's always been. It's not how it is other places that have capitalist economies. And I think we need to think more broadly about what the possibilities are. I also think you're right. I think the fear that people have makes it overwhelming to really engage these questions. And it's easier to say, those guys aren't telling us the truth, right? But that's why I said these recovering environmentalists, as I refer to them, are helpful to me because they're actually looking down, right? They're saying, I'm gonna look at what this despair means. And it's not that the world's gonna end, it's just that we might not be here, right? And so the question is, how do we want to navigate that process and in what directions we might reorganize ourselves so that we have some possibility?
First of all, thank you for everyone to asking questions. That's really encouraging. I heard the word belief around, and you don't believe in climate change. You recognize the knowledge of the scientific community, it's happening. It's beyond belief. Now, each one of you have different kind of approaches to this fact, and what's good about this school is that we can have individualized, that's kind of one of the subtitles of the name of the school, responses to climate change. Some of you would say it's about capitalism, some would say it's about different political system, about religion. Some will say, no, it's about developing this new gadget or an app or whatever. And my role as an educator is to help each one of you develop your response. And I don't think there is one master response. I think there is a whole host of different responses to climate change in order for us to deal with it. And that's actually what we try to do in this school, not to give one master narrative, but many different approaches for each one of you. It will fit each one of you, so to speak.
I would just say that I think all of the anxieties that we're hearing too really reinforces actually part of Ghosh's argument, which is that this is a failure of the imagination, right? The fact that we feel slightly threatened in our current, however we imagine ourselves and the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And our immediate reaction is, no, there is no otherwise. There are no other ways of being in the world. There are no creative solutions. And I would echo both Kim and Peter in saying that this is the challenge that you have, is to imagine from your different individualized points of knowledge that you're going to be embarking on, what are some other possibilities that haven't been thought of before. And also to try and hold the critique and the optimism together, because I think that we often assume that it's either one or the other. Either you are a totally positive, optimistic, creative thinker, or you are depressed, melancholic, lying in the mud and saying, what's the point, we're all gonna be dead anyway. And that's a false choice. You don't have to make that choice. There's room for grief and hope in all of this.
I think we should have just
just a couple more questions, because I absolutely promised this person in the second row that she would go. Can we get, you want to pass this mic to her? Right behind you. There you go. All right.
Thank you. I kind of want to take the discussion back to climate denialism. And while reading Ghosh's book, I realized that while he was talking about the storm in Mumbai, that some people have these moments where they realize climate change is real. And even if they know it's real, they face what it is to see. Kind of like what people in Houston are feeling because it's a red state and there are a lot of climate deniers there. So I was wondering if any of you have a similar experience where you faced climate change and it became real rather than just abstract concept that you can share.
Sure, I mean, I think.
Can we still get more questions in?
Yeah,
all right, so we have one right here, one back here.
Okay. No, I just wanted to respond to the comments that were made over there, because personally, I think that you can't really separate capitalism and climate change. I think that one of the main reasons for climate change is the emissions companies and corporations are giving off. And I think that, like, I mean, if you interpret his book to be collectivist or pushing a collectivist narrative, I think that, like, it's not separate. You can't separate the realities of neoliberalism and climate change. And I think that a collectivist world, or however you want to put it, would be a lot better than a world where everything's flooded or a desert. So that's all.
All right, we had a question back here.
Okay, as I was reading the book, I noticed that he was separating he was trying to figure out who should take the accountability and the responsibility for climate change. And that while I was thinking, well, most people, no one wants to take accountability or responsibility for the human population the chance of the human population just dwindling to non-existence. And it was more like, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the book. Okay, but it was just kind of like, what if the accountability was just separated into groups like just other than just religion and politics, maybe if there's a way to separate the responsibility among just peers, see what exactly everyone is doing to help dwindle down the human population through climate change.
All right.
So many hands up.
We have a lot. It's noon. Do a few more. The great thing is that we can bring these questions and comments to our group discussion right after this. So if you don't get picked right now, you have plenty of time to discuss in your group. All right. From what I see right now is right over here in the back.
Somebody here with that mic.
I know everyone.
I just wanted to bring a comment really quick back to what someone was saying a couple rows behind me about innate desire, and that was kind of like rejected as like something that we should address in this issue, but I disagree, not necessarily with desire, but with like inherent human qualities, and I think two of those are aggression and competition. And I think that even though we live in a finite world, it's really, really difficult to put limits on those things, even if we think creatively and try and regulate. I think that there's always going to be this desire in almost every single person to compete and to get ahead and to win. And so I just have, my question for all of you guys is, how would you address that in a way that's realistic? Because obviously you can't limit like human inherent qualities, and so I guess I just I'm wondering like how you guys think that that would be addressed in a realistic way.
How many more are we doing?
Back here, and let's go over here.
There's a mic there already.
Right. The mic over here? Okay. Good.
So kind of responding to the two questions that were just mentioned, I think Ghosh's book was pretty revolutionary because not only did he kind of give us background, but I think by mentioning like the avant-garde art, mentioning kind of social media, mentioning the parts that we could take in our society, when he mentions these different groups, he's trying to teach us how to feel included in this huge global warming catastrophe that's coming about. I think by backing up each group, he's giving us kind of a formula in which we can make this change. So I think that was his reasoning behind the grouping. And I loved the book because I felt like our society is kind of competitive in many ways. With social media, I think it gives us a broader spectrum to connect with people, and that also encourages us to kind of compete with people. And so I think that this book was also kind of a challenge, but he gave us some answers to the challenge, which is why I think it was really intellectually stimulating, and I really enjoyed it, and I think it was an awesome choice.
Let's get two more, and then we'll have, unfortunately, we'll have to
Somebody
back to
far
respond.
back is having a
Okay, so I wanted to respond to an earlier comment or a question asking about whether or not anybody had any experiences that made them realize how real climate change was. Well, in 2005, we all know what happened in New Orleans with Katrina. Well, at that time, I hadn't turned 8 years old yet, and I lived in a town called Port Sulphur, Louisiana. Port Sulphur is probably an hour and a half south of New Orleans. So it's out there, like the really bottom of the boot, surrounded by water on three sides. So my house was reduced to a concrete slab. So I feel like I have kind of like a unique perspective on the way that capitalism and this kind of shock that you get whenever something like this happens to you. The biggest industry in the state of Louisiana is most likely oil. Everybody works in oil, and I feel like it's driving kind of a selfishness. I'm not saying that we need to abandon capitalism completely, but at this point in our society, it seems like people are more concerned with getting themselves ahead in this game that they think is worth playing than actually protecting the resources that we have and that we need to live. And I wouldn't say that we would be restricting any innate human capabilities, because I don't think that an innate human feeling is to dominate everything around you. I believe that as humans, we were meant to live at peace with the earth, but I feel like the type of capitalism that we have now and the fact that this is becoming more prevalent is really going to start waking people up to the fact that climate change is a very real thing.
Who else has the mic right now?
Who has a mic right now?
No? No?
I do.
All right, one last person.
Keep all those questions in mind for the discussions.
So someone mentioned like distributing like the kind of like the blame on like climate change and like countries working together, and I think that's really hard because you can count as who like emits the most CO2 right now, or you can count like historically what has happened, and I think that working this way is it's gonna cause a lot of disagreement and people saying, well, you should do that more because you've done that in the past, or you should do this. But I think we all need to just agree that from now it's a global issue and that the countries need to come together and all work together. And I think that it is a large issue, especially with the current economy, because it's so competitive and like it's kind of like in a way selfishness for each country and just each community and even individually to want the best and to have more for yourself, that it's very hard for us to work together for something that is such a large issue and that affects everyone at the same time.
Please, faculty.
So I'll start by a response to your comment about innate desires. I think that we all agree that human bodies and minds have certain kinds of needs and forces, but I believe myself that desire is very deeply shaped by the way that you're raised and what things you're taught to think are desirable. And I think that, for me, a very obvious example of that is the way in which some cultures shape the sexual desires that we all have in certain very specific ways. So heterosexual desires and representations of certain kinds of bodies become desirable. Other cultures have different bodies that are desirable, and sometimes in cultures at different time periods, there have also been non-heterosexual desire structures. So I think that part of what Ghosh is trying to talk about in his book, it's not to deny that there are various kinds of, what would be the right word, forces or struggles in the human self, but rather to try to think about how much we're shaped in ways that we aren't necessarily aware of by the stories that we tell ourselves, by the culture that we're born in, by the way that the culture shapes the physical and the political world that we live in. So is it natural to live in a nuclear family? Well, there's something natural. There's a father and a mother, et cetera, right? But many cultures haven't been built around nuclear families. It isn't to say that one is better or worse. I just wanted to challenge your idea that there's a clear-cut, natural, innate, certain way of doing things. I think there's a complex intersection between cultural ideas and values, religious ideas and values, and the bodily, personal qualities of the kind you were describing. So I felt that what Ghosh was trying to do is to take that sort of idea, which you are very free to disagree with, to a larger scale and say that that's happening in an even bigger way than I know it happens with me as an individual. That there's a way in which whole groupings of people are shaped by these stories, these understandings, these assumptions. And that we don't see it altogether. We don't understand it. We don't see what we have blindness to. We rule things out that we don't look at as possibilities. So I just want to say that I don't think that anything he's suggesting is to say that competitiveness is going to disappear. But what is the story we tell about it? Is it a valuable thing? Is it a good thing? I think very interesting in the Hippocrates is where he says certain groups of people with certain climates are more gentle and less warlike, which to me sounds good. It turns out that was bad because the people have a lot of change of climate, are tougher, and are more warlike. And in his value, that was something he wanted to see. So that's just an example of, one very small example of ways in which these things are not set. How we value those features of ourselves are not set, and then the stories that we tell about them really do change us and affect us, even to things we think are natural. And I'll just give one final comment, which is that we think about ourselves as, some people in North America and in the United States and in European cultures think about themselves as having things inside. Inside me, I feel this. I have desire, I have competitive. It's all imagined as internal, right? The Greek culture imagined those as external forces that had a force on you, that were bigger and part of a universe of forces that were bigger. So in a very famous scene in the Iliad, Paris finds that he's going to go and fight, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love, tugs on his tunic. And I always say to my students, have you ever had Aphrodite tug on your tunic? And Paris leaves the battle, and he goes to bed and has sex with Helen instead. They didn't imagine that as inside him. They imagined it as somehow part of a larger universe of attractive forces that pulled him. So just as an example, they felt love, desire and competition too, but they told very different stories about it.
And on that note, we also have the power to proactively shape our values when we find that the culture in which we're embedded doesn't share them, or we find them destructive, or we know deep down that something's wrong. We're not at the mercy of this sort of, unless we keep telling ourselves the story that we're aggressive naturally, we're always going to be competitive, you can't really rein this in. That's a story, and we can tell a different story. And if you read historically, not all societies are like this, and our society hasn't always been like this. We're talking about the United States, and it has in other ways. But, you have to not imagine yourself to have no ability to actually shape that conversation and tell a different story.
Sure. Very brief. So whether you are an environmentalist from New Hampshire or a victim of the hurricane in Katrina from New Orleans, whether you have your other personal backgrounds, bring those personal backgrounds into your perspective. Those are relevant. Those are not irrelevant. Those should be at the core of how you kind of think about what you're going to do. Some of you may think that, oh, I'm not going to deal with climate change during my 4 years at NYU. I've been prepared for law school or med school or be finance or whatever. You are wrong. The winter is not coming. The heat is coming, and it will be part of your life. Climate change will be part of your life. So you need to prepare yourself on how you, each one of you, are going to adapt to it and think about it in your life, approach it. And kind of the ground zero for starting that process is today. And you have 4 years in NYU, and then you have an entire life ahead of you. And the heat is coming.
All right, before we depart, I want one more comment.
So, is it on? Yeah. Oh, wow, sorry. For the rest of the day, if you have your name tag on it, your name tag will have where you're supposed to go for your discussion group. So your discussion group is one of the faculty that you'll be joining to talk in more conversation about this. You will also have a meal provided. Please, let's keep the noise quiet. There's a lot to say, okay? So, if you have your name tag, it will have where you're going. If you don't have your name tag and you don't know where you're going, please find one of us we'll have our hands up out in the lobby, okay? And we'll be able to tell you where you need to go for your discussion group, okay? And then afterwards, keep a lookout for an email or a Facebook post from your Gallatin orientation leaders for where you'll be going for your trip if it is today, okay? That's all.
Before you go, I just want to say a big round of applause to our faculty panel, to all the people who helped make this happen. To you, thank you, and make sure you get to your classrooms. Thank you very much.